Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, listeners, ready to dive in. Today, we're tackling Puerto Rican activism in the U.S. after 1945.
A pivotal period, for sure.
Absolutely. And we're going deep using an excerpt from Mr. Hutchings' History as our guide. You know, what's striking is that it wasn't just about basic rights. It was about this incredible push for cultural recognition, having their voices heard in education, politics, everything.
Absolutely. And it was all happening as the U.S. was going through these massive social changes.
Yeah.
Think of the African-American civil rights movement. All that energy, the demand for equality, it really electrified so many different communities.
Totally. And for Puerto Ricans in mainland cities, it wasn't just inspiration, it was a necessity. Many were facing, poverty, racism, police brutality. The source material really captures how dire the need to organize and fight back was.
Yeah, it was a pressure cooker. And it's fascinating to see how this activism starts to take shape, Neighborhood associations popping up, trade unions becoming more inclusive, and then these really influential national organizations emerge, like Aspira.
Aspira. Now, they were the ones focused on education, right? Tackling that high school dropout crisis head on.
Exactly.
Was that like a strategic move, focusing on education as a way to gain broader support?
That's a really interesting point. Aspira's approach was smart because it tapped into this core American value of education as, the key to success.
Right.
But they weren't just assimilating. They were fighting for educational equity on their own terms. And that legal victory they won in '72, alongside the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, it's a perfect example.
Oh, the bilingual education case.
Yeah.
That must have been a game changer, not just for Puerto Rican students, but for other language minorities, too.
Huge. It set a national precedent. It shows the power of organized legal action, how Aspira used the system itself to force change.
Okay, so we've got Aspira working the education angle, but the source also mentions the Young Lords Party. And honestly, I need a refresher. They weren't exactly playing by the same rules, were they?
Not quite. What's captivating about the Young Lords is their origin story. Think about it. A street gang from Chicago transforming into this powerful political force.
Whoa, that's a serious turnaround. It's almost like, a superhero origin story.
Right.
So what were their demands? What were they fighting for?
Their demands were bold. Community control of schools, an end to those urban renewal projects displacing their neighborhoods. They wanted access to healthcare, welfare rights. They even pushed for Puerto Rican studies in college curriculums.
So they were thinking both immediate needs and long-term goals, like cultural recognition and political power.
Exactly. They knew that real empowerment meant tackling both immediate needs and systemic change. It's interesting to contrast them with Aspira, one working within the system, the other challenging it head-on.
Right, and that difference in tactics, it caused some tension in the movement, didn't it?
It did.
Even with a shared goal, there were those internal divisions about the best way to achieve it. Is that common in movements like this?
Very common. You see it all the time. Different factions emerge, each with their own ideas about, strategy and pace.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how much more effective they might have been with a more unified front.
That's a good point. Okay, so we've got education, social justice, but the legal battles, those were a huge part of this era too, weren't they? The source mentions the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, or PRLDEF.
Yeah, PRLDEF was crucial. They used the courts to fight discrimination in housing, employment. They were amazing at leveraging those legal frameworks to force systemic change.
It's like they were playing 3D chess with the system, finding ways to use its own rules against it.
I like that. And remember, all of this was happening in a very specific context. The 1960s, that whole decade of protest, was this, pressure cooker of social unrest.
Yeah.
How do you think that broader context shaped the activism we're talking about?
Well, I imagine it must have been emboldening, seeing other groups fight for their rights, win victories, challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just organized groups. This activism also took a more, explosive form. Those urban uprisings in places like Perth Amboy, Paterson, Passaic.
Oh, right, the riots.
Yeah.
I mean, those were pretty destructive. Do historians see them as a setback? Or was there a strategic element to them?
It's a complex issue. Some argue that, while destructive, the riots forced the nation to pay attention to the anger and frustration brewing in these communities.
So even though they weren't organized in the traditional sense, they still pushed for change.
In a way, yeah. They kind of ripped the Band-Aid off, exposing the raw wounds of inequality and making it impossible to ignore the need for change.
It's wild how this one source can be so revealing. about the complexities of movements like this. We're seeing legal strategies, community organizing, even like outright rebellion, all at the same time.
You see it all. And all of this, it's really just scratching the surface of the impact. We haven't even touched on figures like Herman Badillo and his entry into the political arena.
Ooh, good point. We've got a lot more ground to cover. Welcome back, everyone. Now, before the break, we were about to dive into politics, specifically Herman Badillo's election to Congress.
Ah, yes, Badillo. His story is a powerful example of the Puerto Rican community's growing political influence. I mean, in '71, he becomes the first Puerto Rican elected to Congress, representing New York City, no less.
Wow, what a moment. What were some of his key achievements?
Well, I mean, beyond that symbolic victory, he was a strong advocate for fair housing policies, pushed for educational reform. But it's interesting.
What's that?
He was also really focused on economic empowerment. He understood that true equality meant addressing the systemic economic barriers that kept so many Puerto Ricans trapped in poverty.
So he was building on the work of groups like Aspira, but broadening the focus to include economic justice.
Precisely. He saw those connections, how education, housing, economic opportunity was all part of the same puzzle.
Makes you think, though, Even with all these victories, were there still challenges the movement couldn't quite overcome?
You're right to bring that up. Progress isn't always a straight line, right?
Right.
Despite these hard-fought gains, issues like persistent poverty, unemployment, they continue to affect many Puerto Rican communities.
Yeah, I guess it's a reminder that systemic change takes time. Even with legal victories and political representation, those economic realities can be hard to shift.
Exactly. And on top of those economic challenges, the source also kind of hints at something we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Those divisions within the movement.
Oh, right. The disagreements over tactics and strategy. Do we have any specific examples of how that played out?
Yeah. Well, think about Aspira and the Young Lords. Two very different approaches, right? Aspira, they were all about working within the system, using legal challenges and education reform to reach their goals. The Young Lords, though, they were much more radical. They wanted community control. Some even advocated for independence. These very different ideologies, they sometimes led to, friction, fragmentation, made it hard to present a united front.
Yeah, like trying to steer a ship with two captains, both pulling in different directions.
That's a great analogy. And these internal tensions weren't the only obstacle. Don't forget the ever-present reality of racial and ethnic discrimination that continued to impact every part of their lives.
Oh, right, that constant prejudice so deeply ingrained in society.
Yeah.
It's easy to forget that even while fighting for these specific rights, they were also battling against this, underlying bias.
Yeah, it adds another layer of complexity to their struggle, doesn't it? Trying to secure equal opportunities when you're constantly facing prejudice based on your ethnicity, your language, your socioeconomic status.
It really highlights how true equality requires more than just changing laws, doesn't it? It takes a real shift in attitudes and perceptions, like dismantling those systems of oppression that keep inequality going.
You got it. And speaking of dismantling systems, the source also touches on the impact of those urban renewal projects.
Oh, yeah. Those were a big issue for the Young Lords, weren't they?
They were. Urban renewal often meant tearing down low-income housing to make way for these revitalized neighborhoods, displacing so many families in the process.
These well-intentioned policies having unintended consequences, especially when those most affected have no say in the decision-making.
Exactly. It shows that complex interplay between policy decisions and the lived experiences of those on the ground.
It makes you wonder, how much of the poverty and displacement they were fighting against was actually made worse by these very projects.
It's a good point. Really highlights that complexity.
So what we're seeing here is a more nuanced picture, right? It's not just about triumph. It's about resilience in the face of immense challenges, victories alongside battles that are still being fought.
Yes. And I think it's so important to emphasize that even amidst these challenges, this movement left a real legacy, one that continues to inspire activism today.
Absolutely. But before we get to that legacy, I realize we haven't really touched on the role of labor unions in all of this.
Oh, that's right. Easy to overlook, but so important.
Was it mainly about fair wages and working conditions, or was there a broader political dimension to it?
It was both, really. Unions gave them a platform for collective bargaining,
Right.
so they could fight for better wages, safer working conditions, protection from discrimination in the workplace.
So it's about economic power, but also about, finding their voice,
Mm.
exercising their collective power.
Exactly. And this involvement in unions, it had ripple effects beyond the workplace, you know?
Oh, how so?
It created this sense of solidarity, provided a space for political organizing, strengthened their ability to advocate for their rights on a larger scale.
Like a training ground for activism.
That's a great way to put it. They learned to negotiate, to mobilize, to use their collective power to push for change. These skills became crucial as they tackled issues beyond the workplace, like we've been talking about.
So we're seeing all these threads, education, legal battles, political representation, labor activism, it's all woven together.
It's a tapestry of resistance and resilience.
And it's that tapestry that shaped their legacy.
It did.
Well, I'm ready to see what that looks like. Let's move on to part 3 and unravel that legacy.
Heck.
Okay, we're back for part 3, ready to finally unpack this legacy. What stands out to you as the most impactful outcome of all this activism?
Well, it's hard to ignore that bilingual education victory in '72. I mean, that wasn't just about language. It was about recognizing the value of cultural identity within the education system.
Yeah. But the source also mentions that even with those wins, challenges remained. It feels like sometimes one step forward, 2 steps back.
Oh, absolutely. Systemic change is rarely a straight line. I mean, think about it. The fight for bilingual education is still going strong today. Those hard-won rights, they need constant defending, expanding.
True. It's like progress isn't a destination, it's a journey.
Exactly.
Speaking of journeys, the whole push for Puerto Rican studies programs in colleges, that feels like a huge win for representation.
It was. Having their history and culture reflected in academia, that's about claiming their space, shaping the narrative. And it keeps evolving today. Ethnic studies programs are becoming more intersectional, more inclusive.
Intersectionality. I hear that word everywhere these days.
Mm-hmm.
Can you break that down for us in this context?
Sure. Intersectionality is about recognizing that different forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, classism, they don't exist in isolation. They all overlap, they intersect. That creates unique challenges for those experiencing multiple forms of marginalization.
So for Puerto Ricans in this era, it wasn't just ethnicity, right? It was also class, language, navigating a system not built for them.
Exactly. And that's why solidarity with other movements was so crucial. The source mentions the African-American civil rights movement being a big inspiration, and in turn, Puerto Rican activists inspired others.
It's like a web of interconnected struggles, right?
Yeah.
Each one strengthening the other. We see that in the labor movement involvement, too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Labor unions offered this space for cross-racial, cross-ethnic organizing, fighting for economic justice, but also building coalitions, learning from each other. Collective action is so powerful, that sense of shared purpose.
But even with all that, the source is clear about the challenges that remained. Honestly, kind of disheartening to see poverty, unemployment still so prevalent.
Yeah, it shows those deep roots of systemic inequality. Makes you wonder, were there any missed opportunities? Ways the movement could have been even more effective?
Good question. One that historians debate, some argue those internal divisions, those disagreements over tactics, maybe that hindered their progress. Others point to lack of resources, that constant struggle for funding.
Right. And some argue that focusing on specific issues like bilingual education, maybe that came at the expense of broader economic goals. It's all about perspective, how you weigh the victories against the ongoing challenges.
So for us today, what can we learn from all this?
I think the biggest takeaway is the power of grassroots organizing. These were ordinary people facing huge challenges who came together and demanded better. They didn't wait for permission, they didn't ask nicely, they organized, they protested, they fought.
And they won some major victories, inspiring even with the setbacks.
It is. And it reminds us that change is possible, but it takes that level of commitment, that willingness to challenge the status quo. What about you? Anything in this deep dive that stood out that you'd want to explore further?
Honestly, I'm fascinated by the internal workings of the movement. The disagreements over strategy, that tension between working within the system versus demanding radical change, feels very relevant today.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
We see those same debates happening in movements today. A reminder that even with shared goals, there will always be different views on how to achieve them.
Well, that's a great thought to leave us with. We've explored the rise of Puerto Rican activism, the victories, the setbacks, and the lasting impact. It's a complex story full of nuance and inspiration.
And it's a story that continues. The fight for equality, for justice, for recognition, it's ongoing.
So to our listeners, keep exploring. Dig deeper into the primary sources, the personal stories, the historical debates. Understanding the past is key to building a more just and equitable future.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.